Guam, August 1945. The war was finally ending, though no one yet dared to believe it. The jungle still smelled of cordite and blood, the air thick with humidity and silence. In a makeshift prisoner compound on the edge of an American supply depot, a group of captured Japanese soldiers sat in stunned quiet, thin, sunburned, eyes hollow. They had been taught that surrender was worse than death, that capture meant torture or execution. Yet none of those things had come. One of them, Private Kenji Takahashi, barely 22, still trembled whenever a Marine approached. But this Marine, a sergeant with rolled-up sleeves and mud on his boots, carried no rifle. In his arms was a small baby, barely a year old, belonging to a local Chamorro woman who had come to the camp to visit her husband. The sergeant stopped in front of Kenji, smiled faintly, and said, "You want to hold him?" Kenji froze. The words didn't make sense. A baby? He looked around for the trick, for the bayonet that should have followed the kindness. But there was none. The sergeant simply nodded, waiting. With trembling hands, Kenji took the child. The baby's warmth shocked him. For the first time in years, he held life instead of death. To understand why that moment shattered everything Kenji Takahashi believed, we must return to the world that created him, a generation raised under the rising sun and the shadow of Bushido. By 1941, the Japanese Empire had built its soldiers on an unyielding code: loyalty to the emperor, honor above life, death before surrender. The concept of gyokusai, to die honorably like shattered jewels, was drilled into every recruit. Captivity, they were told, was the ultimate disgrace, worse than death, worse than defeat. To be captured was to cease existing as Japanese. The Pacific War, fought from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic cliffs of Iwo Jima, was defined by that belief. Americans called their enemy fanatics because they refused to surrender even when surrounded. Entire garrisons charged into machine gun fire rather than raise white flags. Civilians on Saipan and Okinawa leapt from cliffs with children in their arms, convinced the Americans would slaughter them. That fear was not madness. It was propaganda carefully built by the Imperial Army and believed with religious conviction. For the American soldiers landing on Pacific beaches, the result was a kind of fatalism. They learned that mercy could get them killed. Early in the war, Marines who tried to capture wounded Japanese soldiers were often met with grenades clutched beneath shirts. Surrender became suspect, kindness dangerous. Orders hardened. Take no chances. But by 1944, as the tide turned, the U.S. military began capturing more and more survivors, men cut off from their units, starving, delirious, too weak to fight. At first, even they couldn't comprehend their own survival. They hid in foxholes for days after surrendering, waiting for the execution that never came. When it didn't, disbelief became their new prison. In makeshift camps across Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and Hawaii, American guards faced men conditioned to expect cruelty. They refused food, bowed instead of speaking, apologized for still being alive. Some asked for permission to die. The Americans, bewildered, treated them like patients rather than prisoners. They brought water, medical care, cigarettes. Slowly, suspicion turned into confusion. Letters written by U.S. Marines during that period reveal how deeply it affected them. "They look at us like ghosts," one sergeant wrote. "They don't understand why we don't beat them." Another noted, "They flinch when we smile. I guess they've never seen an enemy do that before." On the other side, captured Japanese soldiers wrote in secret diaries describing their astonishment. "Americans speak kindly," one recorded. "They share food, even fruit. They call me sir. I do not understand this world." The military administrators overseeing Pacific POWs understood the psychological importance of such treatment. They hoped to break the spell of imperial propaganda, to show these men that surrender was not dishonor, but survival. Many camps, especially on Guam and Oahu, operated as small experiments in cultural reconstruction. Prisoners were fed well, taught English, and even given work tending gardens or building infrastructure. They were still under guard, but they were treated as human beings. The Japanese captives could not comprehend it. To them, America was supposed to be barbaric, a land of killers. Instead, their captors handed them shovels instead of guns, meals instead of beatings, and sometimes, as incredible as it sounded, children to hold while their parents worked. For the Americans, many of whom had seen their own friends die in island battles, the decision to show mercy was personal. "We had enough killing," one Marine later said. "It felt good to do something human again." That fragile humanity, those moments of unguarded empathy, were the earliest sparks of reconciliation between two nations that had once sworn mutual annihilation. In the summer of 1945, as the war drew to a close and Japan teetered on surrender, thousands of prisoners remained scattered across the Pacific. They had survived the impossible, but they still lived as ghosts of a dead empire. And then, on one quiet island, a single act would pierce through the years of indoctrination like sunlight through armor. A baby placed in a prisoner's hands, soft, breathing, innocent. It was the first time many of them had touched something that wasn't a weapon. The war inside them began to end at that moment. By the summer of 1945, Japan's empire had collapsed, but its soldiers did not yet know it. Across the scattered islands of the Pacific, thousands of men still hid in jungles, clinging to rifles and delusions of victory. Surrender was unthinkable, the shame too vast. Many chose suicide. Others were dragged from caves and foxholes by American patrols after days of standoff, pleading not for food, but for execution. Those who survived were brought to improvised camps on Guam, Tinian, Peleliu, and Hawaii, designed less as prisons and more as holding grounds for the incomprehensible. American forces expected defiance, sabotage, hatred. Instead, they found silence. The captured Japanese soldiers did not shout or protest. They simply knelt, awaiting the bullet that never came. From the very beginning, cultural misunderstanding defined those encounters. When guards offered water, the prisoners refused, fearing it was poisoned. When offered food, they bowed instead of eating. Some apologized for dishonoring their emperor by remaining alive. The Americans, most barely in their 20s, didn't know how to respond. They had fought ghosts, shadows in the jungle who never surrendered, and now those same ghosts were human, shaking, and half-starved before them. The U.S. military understood the stakes. If these prisoners could be treated humanely and their survival publicized, it might undermine the imperial myth that Americans were monsters. And so, under the guidance of the Office of War Information and the Army's Civil Affairs Division, POW management in the Pacific became an exercise in psychology. Camps on Guam and Oahu were staffed with officers trained in Japanese culture and language. Medical units treated wounds without hesitation. Chaplains distributed Bibles and encouraged conversation. The Red Cross delivered mail, and Japanese-language newspapers were allowed circulation. But even with good food and clean quarters, the emotional distance between captor and captive remained immense. To most Japanese soldiers, mercy was as frightening as violence. It inverted everything they had been taught. An officer in one Guam camp wrote, "They accept bread from my hand, but cannot look me in the eye. They think kindness is the prelude to death." And yet something began to change. Slowly, small acts of humanity chipped away at the wall of disbelief. Marines offered cigarettes, medics joked in broken Japanese. When a typhoon struck Guam that August, guards and prisoners worked side by side to repair the fences and dig drainage trenches. For the first time, they sweated together instead of bleeding apart. The transformation deepened when local families, Guamanians, many of whom had survived Japanese occupation, began to visit the camps with food and gifts. American officers hesitated at first, fearing reprisals, but the islanders insisted. "The war is over," one woman said simply. "Let's make sure it stays that way." They brought rice cakes, fruits, and sometimes their children. The sight bewildered the prisoners. These were the very civilians their army had once brutalized, now walking freely among their captors and enemies, smiling, unafraid. For the Japanese, it was like witnessing a new moral universe being born before their eyes. One American lieutenant recorded the moment in his report. A local woman placed her baby in the arms of a Japanese private. The man froze. He looked at the child as though it were a holy thing. He did not move for nearly a minute. Then, very carefully, he smiled. Incidents like that began to ripple through the camp. Guards described prisoners asking about American families, wives, children, farms. The Japanese were astonished to learn that many of their captors were barely older than themselves and eager to return home. Some began teaching origami or writing kanji for curious guards. Others volunteered to help with camp chores, grateful for any gesture of trust. At night, around campfires, soldiers on both sides discovered their shared weariness. "We just wanted to live," one Marine told a captured officer. The man nodded. "So did we," he replied. The American policy of humane treatment, though strategic in part, carried unintended consequences. It humanized the enemy, not only in the prisoners' eyes, but also in the Americans. Guards who had once cursed the Japanese as savages now saw fathers, brothers, and sons. They could not unsee it. "After you've shared a smoke with a man," one guard wrote, "it's hard to imagine shooting him again." The shift was small, fragile, and mostly unseen by the outside world, but within those fences something extraordinary was happening. Where once there had been blind hatred, there was now recognition. Where propaganda had painted monsters, reality had drawn men. By September 1945, Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Yet in the camps, something more lasting than peace had begun, the slow rebuilding of empathy between two nations that had annihilated each other's cities. And at the center of that transformation stood the simplest, purest symbol imaginable, a baby cradled in the arms of a soldier who had forgotten what innocence felt like. For the Japanese prisoners, fear had become a religion. It shaped how they breathed, how they moved, how they thought. Every noise in the camp, every shouted command, every approaching footstep set their nerves on edge. They had been told that capture meant torture, that Americans were demons who desecrated bodies and mocked the dead. When none of that came true, their world fractured quietly inside them. Many guards noticed the same pattern. The first week, the men would eat little and speak less. They bowed compulsively, apologizing for everything, even for being offered food. By the second week, they began to look around, to make hesitant eye contact, to ask for small things, an extra cup of rice, a bandage for a blister. The first time an American smiled, most froze in disbelief, then looked away, confused. "Mercy was their greatest shock," wrote one Marine officer. "We fought them as beasts, but when they saw we were human, it undid them." In one Guam camp, a guard remembered a moment when a prisoner collapsed during work detail. The Americans rushed to lift him, shouting for a medic. The fallen man woke up sobbing, not from pain but confusion. "Why help?" he cried in Japanese. A corpsman, not understanding the words, simply gave him water and said, "You're okay." That sentence, simple, unremarkable, echoed through the compound. The prisoners began to repeat it to one another in broken English. "You're okay." The word spread like permission to exist. For the American soldiers, the act of mercy was not easy. Many had seen friends bayoneted or mutilated in the jungles of Saipan and Iwo Jima. The memory of those battles was still raw. Some guards hated their duty, feeling it dishonored the dead to be gentle with the enemy. "We buried boys who never got mercy," one corporal wrote, "and now we're supposed to give it?" But over time, compassion became its own kind of discipline. It required strength to look at a man you'd been taught to hate and treat him with fairness. "It was like laying down a weapon you didn't know you were holding," a sergeant recalled. American commanders insisted that humane treatment wasn't softness, it was victory. It proved that the U.S. could win the war without losing its conscience. When prisoners were seen not as monsters, but as men broken by an ideology, hatred began to drain away, not immediately, not entirely, but enough to breathe again. The Marines began noticing that treating captives well didn't weaken morale. It steadied it. "You could feel the poison leaving," one guard said years later. "We stopped fighting ghosts and started remembering we were human." In Japanese culture, children represented purity, untainted spirits closer to the divine. To hold a baby was to touch innocence itself. That was why the moment Kenji Takahashi and others were allowed to hold local babies struck them so deeply. For years they had been instruments of death. To cradle life again was almost unbearable. Guamanian mothers, whose families had survived brutal occupation, shocked everyone by showing forgiveness first. Some said they wanted the prisoners to see what they had tried to destroy and understand the value of life. "If they see our children," one woman told a Marine interpreter, "they will remember their own." The prisoners approached the infants as if approaching a shrine, hesitant, reverent, terrified of doing harm. Their rough, calloused hands trembled as they touched soft skin for the first time since leaving home. Some wept openly, others whispered prayers. Kenji would later describe the moment in his diary. "The baby reached for my finger. I had held a rifle for so long that I forgot my hands could do this." The Americans watching were equally moved. To see men who had fought ferociously days earlier now cradle children with trembling gentleness changed how they saw the enemy and themselves. "I didn't see a Japanese soldier," one Marine said. "I saw a father who forgot how to be one." As weeks passed, the camp's atmosphere shifted. The guards began to linger after shifts, talking quietly with the prisoners. The Japanese taught origami and simple songs. The Americans taught baseball and slang. Laughter, small, uncertain at first, returned to a place that had known only fear. The first time a baby giggled in a prisoner's arms, everyone nearby froze. The sound carried through the yard, light and high and astonishing. It was like the world itself exhaled. The guards smiled, the prisoners bowed their heads, and for one suspended heartbeat there was no war, no ideology, no hate, just life. Years later, when those same men were old and gray, they would tell that story again and again. Some said it was the moment they realized Japan had lost more than a war. It had lost its soul, and somehow, in that baby's laughter, they found a piece of it again. Through these angles, human, moral, cultural, and emotional, the story of that moment deepens. It was never just about mercy between soldiers. It was about what happens when men trained to kill are reminded that they still have hands made to hold. For many of the American soldiers guarding those camps, faith had become fragile by 1945. They had seen too much: mass graves in the Philippines, burned villages, friends lost to sniper fire. Their prayers had turned into reflexes whispered out of habit more than hope. But something began to stir inside those fences, where they found themselves offering care instead of bullets. Some Marines later said that watching enemy soldiers cry while holding children changed how they understood forgiveness. "We didn't plan it," one chaplain recalled. "We were just tired of death. But in that tiredness, we remembered grace." The Japanese prisoners felt it too. They had been stripped of everything, their flags, their weapons, their emperor's voice on the radio, and still they were fed. Still they were spared. It was a revelation they could not name. For men raised on the idea that the enemy had no soul, to see kindness given freely was a shock close to spiritual rebirth. One Japanese corporal wrote in his journal before being shipped home, "I thought our gods had forsaken us, but the Americans feed us rice and their children smile. Maybe the gods did not leave, we just forgot where to look." Faith in that place was no longer about religion. It was about remembering the possibility of good after the world had ended. The Imperial Japanese Army had spent years perfecting psychological control over its soldiers. Every recruit was told the same mantra: to surrender is to cease being Japanese. The shame of capture was so complete that even family registers back home would mark them as dead. So when kindness replaced cruelty, the captives entered a state psychologists would later call cognitive collapse. The foundation of their identity cracked. They had been prepared to meet hatred, one American officer noted, but not decency. The effect was profound. Many prisoners began to question not just the war, but the system that had demanded their blind loyalty. For the first time, they saw the emperor as mortal, the propaganda as lies. One man confessed to an interpreter, "If this is our enemy, then what were we fighting for?" American psychologists working in the camps realized they were witnessing a quiet revolution of the mind. Treating POWs with respect didn't just preserve order, it dismantled indoctrination far more effectively than interrogation ever could. The prisoners' fear melted not through force, but through bewildered gratitude. The human brain, stripped of hate, finds its way back to empathy. And in that empathy, the war inside those men began to end. From a military standpoint, the humane treatment of Japanese POWs was a strategic gamble. The U.S. had every reason to expect sabotage, resistance, and suicide attempts. Instead, by 1945, reports from Guam and Oahu described unprecedented cooperation. Prisoners volunteered for labor, built roads, cleaned barracks, and even sang songs during work. The success astonished the War Department. A classified 1946 Army study concluded that respectful treatment yielded higher morale and obedience than punitive measures. In other words, kindness worked. It saved resources, prevented revolts, and fostered post-war goodwill long before treaties were signed. But those bureaucratic summaries missed the emotional truth. The policy succeeded because it was real. It wasn't propaganda. It was men doing what their hearts told them was right, even after years of being told compassion had no place in war. The same soldiers who had once fought through hellish beaches now watched their former enemies nurse infants. "We came to break their empire," a Marine sergeant said. "Instead, they broke our hate." Decades later, those babies, the ones held in the camps on Guam and Saipan, grew up hearing stories their parents could hardly believe. "The soldiers who occupied us gave water to our captors," one woman said. "They let my father's enemy hold me so he could remember what peace looked like." Some of the Japanese prisoners who survived wrote memoirs, small and humble, that circulated quietly in Japan during the 1950s. They spoke not of defeat, but of rediscovery. One former officer, Lieutenant Shiro Watanabe, wrote, "The first American who smiled at me won the war without firing a shot. The day I held a baby, I knew I would never fight again." Those words found their way into classrooms decades later as Japan rebuilt itself, not as an empire, but as a democracy grounded in pacifism. The seeds of that transformation were not all planted in Tokyo's political halls. Some were sown in tropical camps, where men rediscovered mercy in the unlikeliest of places. When American veterans returned to Guam in the 1970s for commemorations, several were reunited with former prisoners. They spoke haltingly through interpreters, sharing photographs of grandchildren. One elderly Japanese man brought a faded picture of a baby he had once held, now an adult woman standing beside him, smiling through tears. "She is why I changed," he said. Through these angles, faith, psychology, history, and legacy, the story expands far beyond the fences of a POW camp. It becomes a meditation on what happens when soldiers stop obeying hate long enough to see the humanity standing across from them. The next night in Guam, under lanterns strung across a clearing, the act would repeat itself one final time. A Marine would hand his daughter to a trembling prisoner, and the war that had destroyed millions would, for a few minutes, forget itself entirely. The evening sky over Guam in late August 1945 carried the color of cooling embers, gold fading into violet, a hush settling over the island that had seen too much fire. Inside the compound at Agana Heights, the Japanese prisoners finished their evening meal of rice and canned vegetables, sitting in neat rows, their discipline still intact even in captivity. Outside the wire, American Marines leaned against jeeps, talking softly, lighting cigarettes that flared orange in the dusk. The war was over. Everyone knew it, but no one yet knew what peace should feel like. The air was thick with both relief and the strange emptiness that follows survival. Among the guards that night was Sergeant William Harris, 24, from Oklahoma. He had fought through Guam's jungles, buried friends there, and still carried shrapnel in his shoulder. To him, the prisoners inside the fence were ghosts from the same nightmare, faces from an army that had ambushed his unit months earlier. Yet even he felt the tension dissolving. They were just boys, he'd written home. Scared. Same as us. Behind the compound, a small group of local civilians gathered. They were Chamorro Islanders who had survived occupation, now helping with camp duties. Among them was a young mother named Ana Santos with a baby boy in her arms. The soldiers adored the child. His laughter was one of the few pure sounds left on the island. That evening, as Harris stood near the gate, Ana approached to thank him for helping her family rebuild their home. The prisoners watched through the wire, curious, silent. Harris smiled at the baby, who reached toward him, fascinated by the glint of his dog tags. Ana laughed. "He likes soldiers," she said. Then something remarkable happened. One of the Japanese prisoners, a lean young man with sunken eyes, stepped forward from the crowd. His name was Kenji Takahashi, the same man who weeks earlier had refused food for fear of poison. He bowed deeply, hands trembling. Through the interpreter, he said quietly, "The baby. May I see him?" The request froze everyone. The guards exchanged glances. Even Ana hesitated. The idea of letting a former enemy touch her child seemed unthinkable. And yet, there was something in Kenji's face that wasn't threat or pride, but longing. The kind of longing only a father would understand. Harris looked at Ana. She hesitated again, then nodded once. "Yes," she said softly. "Let him remember what life is." Harris motioned for Kenji to step closer. The prisoner approached the gate slowly, eyes lowered. The guard unlocked a side panel, just enough space for human contact, and extended his arms. Ana placed the baby gently into Harris's hands. Harris looked at Kenji, then at the infant, then back again. "Be careful," he said. Kenji reached out as though handling glass. When the child settled into his arms, a visible tremor passed through him. He stared, motionless, unable to believe the warmth pressing against his chest. The baby's small fingers curled around his sleeve. For a long moment, no one spoke. The guards stood still, rifles lowered. The other prisoners pressed closer to the fence, eyes wide. The only sound was the baby's soft cooing and the steady chorus of crickets in the distance. Kenji bowed his head, and tears fell silently down his face. "He is warm," he whispered in Japanese. The interpreter's voice wavered as he translated. "He says he forgot how life feels." The baby laughed, a pure, bright sound that cut through the heaviness of the air. Harris felt his throat tighten. Anna covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. Even the other prisoners began to weep quietly, some hiding their faces. Kenji looked up and said something else, words that took the interpreter a moment to find. He says, "If this child can live, then maybe Japan can too." The guards didn't know what to do with the emotion flooding them. Harris stepped forward and placed a hand lightly on Kenji's shoulder. "You've got a gentle touch," he said quietly. "You're safe here. No more fighting." Kenji nodded once, clutching the baby like a promise. When he finally handed the child back, he did so slowly, reverently, as if returning something sacred. That night, long after lights out, the prisoners in Compound C didn't sleep. They sat under the stars, talking softly, passing a single cigarette down the line. One of them began to hum, a lullaby from home. The others joined in, their voices low, almost broken. The melody drifted past the wire, carried by the same wind that rustled through the palm trees. Sergeant Harris lay awake in his tent, listening. "They sound like us," he wrote in his journal. "Same notes, same ache. Maybe that's all peace ever is, a lullaby instead of a gunshot." In that quiet, the world had shifted, not through treaties or surrender, but through the fragile weight of a child in a soldier's arms. The next morning broke in silver light and gentle rain, washing the island clean. The sound of water dripping from palm leaves replaced the gunfire that once echoed across Guam's ridges. The war was over, but what remained inside the camp was something stranger, an awkward, tender quiet that neither side quite knew how to hold. The story of the baby in the soldier's arms had already spread through the compound. It passed from tent to tent, whispered in disbelief, retold by guards in the mess hall and prisoners in hushed circles. The men who had seen it with their own eyes struggled to describe it. "It was like watching guilt turn into light," one Marine said. That morning, Sergeant Harris noticed something subtle. When he called roll, the prisoners no longer averted their gaze. They stood straighter, not in arrogance, but in dignity. Kenji bowed deeper than usual, his movements calm. His expression changed. Something in him had softened, though no one could name it. Later that day, as supplies were being loaded, Anna returned to the camp carrying her baby on her hip. The guards greeted her warmly, joking about the child being the camp commander. The Japanese prisoners looked up from their work, smiling cautiously. When Anna noticed Kenji among them, she paused, then did something that none of the Americans expected. She walked over to the fence again. Kenji immediately bowed, hands trembling, unsure if he should speak. Anna looked at him and said quietly through the interpreter, "Yesterday, you were afraid. Are you afraid today?" He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I am ashamed." She nodded, understanding more than words could carry. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she lifted the baby once more and held him toward Kenji through the wire. "Then remember this instead of shame," she said. Kenji reached out with both hands, unable to stop his tears. The baby laughed again, grabbing at his fingers. Harris stood nearby, watching silently, his heart tight in his chest. In that instant, all the noise of war, the screams, the bombs, the hatred, seemed impossibly far away. The other prisoners stood transfixed. For the first time since their capture, they saw one of their own touch something beautiful without fear. They saw forgiveness made visible, alive in a mother's gesture and a child's laughter. The moment was so disarming that even the guards felt it shift something inside them. an unspoken recognition that they were witnessing more than compassion. They were witnessing the end of war itself, in spirit if not in history. Later that afternoon, a sudden downpour sent everyone running for cover. The prisoners huddled in their shelters, and the guards dashed into tents, laughing at the sky's timing. The baby, wrapped in a towel, cried briefly, then fell asleep in Anna's arms. From the corner of the compound, Kenji watched her silhouette through the rain, small and steady, like a lantern that refused to go out. That night, when the guards brought out leftover bread and fruit for the prisoners, Kenji stepped forward to accept it for his group. He bowed deeply and said in halting English, "Thank you for today. We will not forget." Harris nodded. "Neither will we," he replied. In his journal that night, Harris wrote a single line. "We've been holding weapons so long, we forgot what our hands were made for." Across the fence, Kenji was writing too. His entry read, "A woman gave her child to her enemy, and the enemy trusted him. The war is over in me now." The days that followed carried the rhythm of quiet transformation. The prisoners began helping the locals rebuild damaged huts, volunteering without orders. The guards found excuses to talk instead of command. When the first repatriation orders came through, the mood in the camp was unexpectedly heavy. No one wanted to say goodbye. On their last night, a farewell gathering was arranged, nothing official, just a shared dinner under the soft light of oil lamps. Marines, locals, and prisoners sat within sight of each other, separated still by a fence, but not by hatred. Kenji stood near the gate, eyes searching the crowd, until he saw Anna with her child. She smiled and raised the baby's small hand in a wave. Kenji bowed deeply, pressing his forehead against the fence. The baby giggled once more, and the sound carried across the camp, like the first bird call after a storm. It was fragile, fleeting, but real. That night, before the lights went out, one of the prisoners whispered a prayer. "May every soldier hold a child before he dies, so he remembers why he should live." No one knew who said it first, but the words spread quietly, like a shared heartbeat, echoing long after the fences were gone. And in the hush that followed, the island seemed to breathe again. When the war ended officially in September 1945, the Japanese prisoners on Guam were among the first to feel the strange weight of peace. Orders came from command: begin repatriation. But how do men who believed they were already dead return to life? How does one go home after rediscovering what mercy feels like? The Americans prepared the process with military precision: medical checks, name lists, vaccinations, and small envelopes of pay earned during labor duty. Yet for both guards and prisoners, it felt more like a farewell between unlikely friends than an administrative task. Kenji Takahashi spent his final week in quiet service. He helped clean the camp, repaired broken tools, and carved small toys from scrap wood, birds, boats, and tiny dolls. When a Marine asked what they were for, he said softly, "For the children. They should play, not remember war." Sergeant William Harris, too, had changed. His anger, once sharp and constant, had faded into something gentler. He still dreamed of battle, of comrades lost in jungle mud, but the bitterness that followed had begun to ease. "Maybe forgiveness isn't a feeling," he wrote in a letter home. "Maybe it's a habit, something you keep practicing until it stops hurting." On the morning of departure, the camp was unusually still. The prisoners stood in formation, not as soldiers, but as men waiting for passage back to a broken homeland. The Americans lined the road leading to the trucks, their uniforms pressed, their faces solemn. The war that had begun with screaming now ended in silence. As Kenji approached the gate, Anna was waiting. She wore a white dress, holding her baby, now walking clumsily on his own. She said nothing at first. Instead, she placed a small bundle in his hands, a piece of cloth wrapped around a single seashell and a sprig of flowers. "So you remember," she said. Kenji bowed deeply. His voice trembled. "I will remember your child," he said through the interpreter. He showed me my heart was still alive. She smiled, tears catching in the morning light. "Then keep it alive," she said. Before boarding, Kenji turned to Harris. The two men shook hands through the open gate, something forbidden months before, but now impossible not to do. "We were enemies," Kenji said quietly. "Now we are fathers." Harris nodded. "That's the better title anyway." As the trucks rolled toward the harbor, the baby waved, his small hand flapping in the breeze. Every prisoner who saw it lifted his arm in return. The gesture looked nothing like surrender. It looked like grace. When the convoy disappeared beyond the hills, Harris lingered alone at the gate. The sea wind carried the faint smell of salt and diesel. In his breast pocket, he kept a small origami crane, a gift Kenji had folded the night before. Harris touched it lightly and thought about all the men he'd lost, the years spent hating faces he'd never known. For the first time, the hate felt like something he could let go. That night, the camp felt empty. The fences still stood, but they surrounded nothing, only the ghosts of voices, laughter, and one unforgettable sound, a child's giggle echoing across the wire. The voyage home was long and silent. The transport ship carrying hundreds of Japanese prisoners cut through the Pacific under gray skies, its decks lined with men staring eastward toward a homeland they hadn't seen in years. For many, the idea of returning filled them with dread, not relief. They would land as survivors of shame, men who had surrendered when their code demanded death. But inside that shame lived something new, something stubborn, a spark of humanity reignited in a faraway camp where an enemy's child had once reached for their hands. Kenji stood among them, his small bundle of gifts tucked safely in his pack, the shell, the flowers, and a photograph Sergeant Harris had quietly slipped inside before departure. On the back of the photo, in shaky handwriting, was a single sentence: "To remember the day mercy won." When the ship reached Yokohama, the scene was surreal. The city lay in ruins, scorched earth, bent steel, silence where once there had been life. Women in kimonos scavenged rubble, children played near bombed-out foundations. Japan had surrendered, but what lay before them did not feel like peace. The returning prisoners were processed in tents, their names written down, their bodies examined, their loyalty questioned. Many expected scorn or imprisonment from their own countrymen, but what they found was indifference. The empire they had served no longer existed. The emperor's voice, broadcast weeks earlier, had already told them the unthinkable. The war was over, and survival was no longer shame. Kenji spent months helping rebuild a small fishing village near Sendai. He spoke little of his captivity, but the people around him noticed a stillness in him, a calm that seemed unshakable. When children gathered near the docks, curious about the quiet man who carved toys from driftwood, he would smile and hand them one. "Play," he'd say softly. "Play, so you never have to remember." In the evenings, he kept a small shrine beside his cot. On it sat the seashell from Anna, a photo of Harris, and a hand-drawn image of a baby's hand reaching for his sleeve. He prayed, not for forgiveness, but for continuity, that the kindness he'd seen would ripple outward, unseen but enduring. Back in the United States, Harris had returned to Oklahoma, married, and started a family. He rarely spoke about the war, but his children remembered the small wooden crane that sat on his desk. When they asked where it came from, he'd say only, "A man I met in Guam taught me how to stop fighting." Years later, in 1962, Harris received a letter written in careful English and posted from Japan. It was from Kenji. Sergeant Harris, I hope you still have the little bird. I still have your picture. My children know your name. I tell them the story of the day an American soldier gave me a baby to hold. That day, I became a man again. Thank you for seeing me when I could not see myself." Harris never wrote back. He couldn't find the words, but he placed the letter beside the crane. The two stayed together for the rest of his life. When Kenji died in 1987, his eldest daughter found his journal. On the final page, written in Japanese, was a single sentence: "Peace began the day I held life instead of a bayonet." It became his epitaph. And somewhere in rural Oklahoma, in a quiet attic, the paper crane still waits beside an old photograph, its wings yellowed with time, its folds delicate but unbroken. Proof that the smallest act of trust between enemies can outlast empires. History tends to remember victory by the noise it makes, the gunfire, the parades, the treaties signed under flashbulbs. Yet the truest victories of the Second World War were often silent, unseen, passed gently from one pair of hands to another. What happened in that camp on Guam was not strategy or diplomacy. It was something infinitely rarer: the moment two enemies stopped seeing uniforms and started seeing life. A child became the bridge between worlds that words could never cross. For a brief, trembling instant, mercy replaced ideology, and both men realized that survival meant more than breathing. It meant remembering how to feel. To the Americans, it was a small act of decency after years of horror. To the Japanese prisoners, it was an event that rewrote the very laws of their existence. They had been taught that surrender was shame, that compassion was weakness. And yet, the day a U.S. soldier placed a baby in their arms, they learned a different truth: that peace is not something granted by treaties or flags, but something fragile and human, carried in the warmth of another's touch. Years later, when veterans on both sides tried to explain what redemption looked like, they spoke of small gestures: a cigarette shared, a bowl of rice offered, a child's laughter echoing through barbed wire. Acts so ordinary they seemed invisible, and yet they restored the world piece by piece. The war had destroyed nations, but it could not destroy the human instinct to protect life. That was the real victory, the quiet defiance of kindness in a time built for cruelty. Perhaps that's why, when the last survivors were asked what they remembered most, they didn't mention the battles or the bombs. They spoke instead of the day a baby reached for a soldier's hand and an enemy remembered he still had a heart. Because in that moment, on that small island, far from glory or applause, humanity held itself together. One trembling hand, one innocent child, one act of grace at a time.